As United States involvement in Vietnam escalated in the early 1960s, Bell's AH-1 Iroquois, or Huey, became the primary helicopter for all airborne combat operations. The new concept of air cavalry required U.S. forces to be highly mobile across a wide area. That concept was made practical by the Huey. Unlike previous wars, the Sky Troopers did not march to battle, but were carried at 100 miles an hour by fleets of AH-1 Hueys across the jungles and mountains of Vietnam to fight an elusive enemy wherever and whenever they were found. It didn't take long to see that unarmed Hueys were vulnerable to ground fire from the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops, especially as they came down to drop their soldiers in a landing zone. With no ground troops or artillery to soften up the defenses, the simplest way to clear a landing zone was from the air. By 1962, a small number of armed AH-1As were used as escorts, armed with multiple machine guns and rocket mounts. Though the AH-1A was eventually upgraded into the larger, more capable AH-1B and AH-1C variants, it soon became apparent that a purpose-built helicopter gunship with increased speed and killing power was needed. Intrigued by the idea of a dedicated helicopter gunship, since as early as 1958, Bell unveiled a mock-up of such a machine in June 1962. The D-225 Iroquois Warrior was built largely from existing systems borrowed from the Huey, but featured a new fuselage that was radically different from the choppers of the time. A tandem two-seat cockpit that placed the gunner up front and the pilot in the rear allowed Bell engineers to create a fuselage over 60 inches narrower than that of a Huey. This new design made the aircraft much more difficult to attack, since it presented a much smaller frontal target than the helicopters before it. The pressures of the Vietnam War meant the Army needed a gunship helicopter right away, and so in 1965, the service initiated a competition for an interim gunship based on an existing helicopter type that could be put into combat as quickly as possible. After an air competition for the interim gunships in November 1965, the Model 209 was so clearly ahead of the pack that the Army placed a contract with Bell for 110 of the production gunships. The production Model 209 came to be known as the AH-1, or Huey Cobra, though its Huey ancestry was quickly forgotten and eventually was referred to simply as the Cobra. The Bell AH-1 Cobra's slim fuselage and wide-bladed rotor design gave it twice the speed of the Huey. It could hover over the target area 3 times as long, waiting to strike with an improved armament system unmatched in previous gunships. The Cobra was armed with a 2.75-inch folding fin aerial rockets and a chin turret-mounted M134 7.62mm minigun and the M129 40mm grenade launcher. It could also be armed with a single minigun in a side-mounted gun pod and an M195 20mm automatic gun. The minigun could be selected for rates of fire of 2,000 or 4,000 rounds per minute. The turret could be aimed 25 degrees upward, 60 degrees downward, and over 230 degrees of arc. While many gunship crews loved the speed, agility, and hard-to-hit slender lines of the Cobra, some preferred the old Huey gunships. The door gunners not only provided additional eyes and ears, they could also lay down suppressive fire to the rear of the helicopter. The debate between the two factions went on throughout the war. Although the gunner was the primary operator for the turret, the pilot could fire it in the fixed forward position in an emergency. The gunner also had a set of simple flight controls that allowed him to fly the machine if push came to shove. The AH-1 arrived at Bien Hoa Air Force Base in South Vietnam in August 1967 and was immediately thrust into heavy combat areas. Cobras were used extensively to escort transport helicopter forces into hostile landing zones and provide close air support for ground troops. Cobras were also used in other roles when necessity demanded, including armed reconnaissance, target spotting, and even search and rescue. A total of 1,116 AH-1Gs were ultimately built, with the last delivered in February 1973. About 300 were lost in Vietnam, with about a third of those lost in non-combat related accidents. The end of America's involvement in Southeast Asia did not mean the end of the snake's bite. AH-1 Cobras were deployed for Operation Urgent Fury, the invasion of Grenada in 1983. There, they flew close air support for the ground troops and helicopter escort missions for the Hueys. They were also called upon during the U.S. invasion of Panama in 1989 during Operation Just Cause. During Operation Desert Shield and Operation Desert Storm, the Cobras and Sea Cobras played in a support role. The aircraft were fitted with engine inlet sand filters and operated from forward sites in the desert. 3 AH-1s were lost in accidents during the end-around by coalition armor forces, but they destroyed hundreds of Iraqi armored vehicles and other targets along the Highway of Death.